site of the first capital. Well, the Japanese use something called feng shui. I'm sure you've heard of feng shui, Chinese geomancy, to choose where the new capital should be. So this was Nara was actually situated on a very lucky site because it's surrounded by mountains on three sides and water on one side. So this was, according to feng shui, a good luck site. So that's why it was chosen based on these facts. You have three mountains on three sides and then water on one side. And when Nara was built, it was actually laid out in a grid or symmetrical fashion. And I'll show you what I mean by that in the next slide. It was basically all the bureaucratic offices and the palace were laid out in a grid-like fashion, with the palace in the middle and the offices and the residences of the ministers surrounding the palace. And this is exactly how the Chinese capital of Chang'an, now it is known as Xi'an, but at that time it was Chang'an, was modeled. And so, of course, the Japanese used that as a model. So this is what the capital looked like, as you can see, grid-like fashion with the palace in the middle. So it's very easy to navigate. The offices were all laid out in a very easy fashion. So it's very easy and very good in terms of a capital city design. So Nara was actually very cosmopolitan for the time. And this is because it was heavily influenced by Chinese and Buddhist culture, art, architecture, very modern. Thanks to the missions, people would go to China, they would stay in Chang'an, they would come back and build Nara based on what they saw there. Okay, and it wasn't only Chinese influence, believe it or not. Visitors and art came in not only from China but also from India and from Persia. Okay, it was very, very far away, but keep in mind that at that time China engaged in a lot of trade with India and China, and so through the trade with China, Japan also was exposed to India and Persia as well. And buildings in the Nara period were constructed also in this Chinese style. So essentially you would have a courtyard in the middle where you would have entertainment and gardens, and then you would have wooden one-story buildings surrounding this center garden, and they would always be connected by corridors that would go from one of buildings to another building. In one building, we would have a living area. The other would have rooms for people to sleep. Generally, men and women slept in different quarters, of course. Children were raised in this totally separate quarter. So, this is all based on Chinese-style architecture. Okay, none of this was based on Japanese architecture. This is all taken in from China. As we know, we've heard that the Chinese were very notorious for and kept very meticulous written records, history of their country and its neighboring countries. That's how we found out about the land of Wa, remember, or Yamatai in the Jomon and Yayoi and Tun periods. So now that the Japanese have a writing system, they say, okay, hey, let's make our own history book. And so during the Nara period, you see the two oldest Japanese books ever published. That's what the Nara period is partly famous for. And they are history books, just like the Chinese model. And the oldest book ever written in Japan is the Kojiki, written in 712, just 2 years after the Nara period started. And then the Nihon Shoki was followed after it in 720. So the Kojiki was written in 712. This is essentially a history of Japan from its creation until the year 500. So basically right before the introduction of Buddhism in Japan. And this is a very heavily Shinto text, okay? And it really talks about Shinto creation myths, right? So for example, we talked about Izanagi and Izanami, who gave birth to the sun goddess. All of that is written about in the Kojiki. So it's a very heavily Shinto text. It's not a holy book per se. Some scholars actually cite that this is an example of if there was a holy text for Shintoism, it would be something like this. But it's not a holy text. It's more of a mythology talking about various Shinto gods, the genealogy of the ancient mythical emperors, starting from Emperor Jimmu, who is the direct descendant of the sun goddess, and how they eventually came to the present emperors. So it really is a creation myth type of document. And very, very difficult to understand. It's written in Chinese characters, but then they were supposed to be pronounced phonetically in Japanese. So it was very hard for people to read. Eight years later, the Nihon Shoki was written. It also discusses Shinto mythology, but it's more of a recent history of Japan, talking about the Asuka period. So a lot of what we know about the Asuka period, like about Prince Shotoku, or the Taika reforms, the Taiho reforms, a lot of this is described in the Nihon Shoki. Okay, so remember I was talking about how Prince Shotoku might have been a myth. The theory is, well, maybe he was made up by the authors of the Nihon Shoki. We don't know that, but that's a theory that has been floating around. The Nihon Shoki is considered more accurate than the Kojiki because it's less mythological and deals more with more recent historical events. And this one was also written entirely in kanji, in Chinese characters, but it was actually supposed to be read in Chinese. So usually the only people who could read it at that time were people who had studied in China. They had gone to China as part of the missions. They would then interpret it for others. In the year 724, beginning of the Nara period, Emperor Shomu becomes the emperor. He ascends the throne, succeeding his father. And he was a devout Buddhist, extremely devout, and he is actually considered the most devout Buddhist emperor in Japanese history. Remember, Shotoku was never an emperor. His aunt was. His late father was, but he was the regent, so he never became an emperor. Emperor Shomu actually becomes the emperor. He ascends the throne, and he's considered the most Buddhist emperor. And he actually declares that Buddhism is the protector of the state, gives it this official title. And keep in mind that at the beginning of the Nara period, especially, Buddhism was still rather complex. Okay, the majority of common people, especially farmers, and they had no idea what it was. They didn't really understand the concepts of suffering and all this. They couldn't read, of course. The only people who could read were members of the upper classes. So because they couldn't read, it was very difficult for them to follow along all the philosophical aspects of Buddhism. And so people really just believed in it as being magic. They said, well, this is magic. If you believe in Buddhism, good things will come to you. So they believed in its magical potential because it was still kind of hard to understand for many Japanese, especially for the lower classes. Only the scholars and the monks were able to devote so much time to really researching and understanding what Buddhism was all about. So Emperor Shomu's accomplishment was, he said, I'm going to build the temple to end all temples. So he constructs Todaiji Temple in Nara, right in the center. And Todaiji was built to be considered a national center of Buddhism in Japan. Since Buddhism is the protector of the state, we need a temple to house all of this great energy and this great religion. So Todaiji was considered the center of Buddhism in Japan. Because it's the central temple, Buddhist temple of all Japan, it had branch temples and nunneries in each province, so that if you went to any province, you had a temple that was affiliated directly with Todaiji Temple in the city of Nara. Okay, and it's a huge property. It's still around today. You can still go, but it actually used to be even bigger than it is now. Numerous buildings, all in the center of the capital city of Nara. Okay, and Todaiji Temple was Emperor Shomu's accomplishment. So remember how Ise Shrine is the most holy shrine in Shintoism? When the capital was moved to Nara, and Nara becomes the capital city, Todaiji is built as the most holy Buddhist temple in the entire country. So don't confuse Todaiji Temple with Horyuji Temple. Horyuji is the oldest wooden building in the world. Todaiji is the largest wooden building in the world. So they're actually a little different, oldest versus largest. Of this huge wooden building. So if you go inside the Todaiji temple, you can see this right in front of you. This is kind of what it looks like, and as you walk in, facing the entrance. And this event is really not talked about so much, but it really did happen. Emperor Shomu, after this, the building of Todaiji, Emperor Shomu says, well, my job is done, so I'm abdicating the throne. He says, I'm no longer going to be emperor, and he becomes a Buddhist monk. And he appears in front of the great Buddha at the ceremony and says, I'm done. My job is done as emperor. I built the Todaiji temple. I can now retire in peace. I'm now a servant to the Buddha and to spreading Buddhism. But unfortunately, his role as a priest didn't last long because he dies only 4 years later in 756. And he is succeeded by his successor, I believe it is his son, becomes the next emperor. So when you go to Todaiji Temple and before you enter the Great Hall where the Great Buddha is, you will see 2 clay sculptures of these guardian deities, these lesser Buddhist deities, and they're supposed to have a scary face because their purpose is to scare away demons or evil spirits who are trying to harm the temple and the Great Buddha. So as you walk in, you'll see them glaring at you through the entrance. That's their purpose. They're supposed to guard the Great Buddha and Todaiji Temple from evil. Another thing you can see in Nara, if you visit, is the Shoshoin storehouse. This is only opened up once every few years for an exhibition. This is because it's still owned by the imperial family. And it contains over 1,000 ancient artifacts from the Asuka period and the Nara period. And so they only open it up for exhibitions about once every 2 or 3 years. I think now they might even open it up once a year, but you have to check the dates before you go. Otherwise, you'll just see the storehouse itself, but you can't go inside to see any of the exhibitions. And the Shoshoin warehouse actually contains Emperor Shomu's personal belongings, his own things, and his books and his documents, especially Buddhist sutras documentation. And it even contains ritual items that were used at the eye-opening ceremony of the Great Buddha in 752. So if you want to do more research about that big ceremony, that has all the commemorative gifts that were brought by the guests who attended from India, from Persia, from China, from Korea. So that's how we know that all these people from different parts of the world came to Nara at that time, because their gifts are actually housed inside this storehouse. Right after Todaiji opens, in the year 753, Japan is kind of becoming more famous around that region. And so a Chinese priest from China, his name was Ganjin, he was invited to Japan to teach Buddhism to the Japanese, more about Buddhism. Remember, it's still a mystery to many people. So Ganjin was invited by the government, by the emperor, to make Buddhism more accessible to the common people. So Ganjin, being a priest, a Buddhist monk, says, I would love to come. And every time he tries to come, something happens. There's a shipwreck, there's piracy, something goes wrong, and so he actually has to turn back 6 different times to go back to China. Something happens, bad weather, and it's just a big mess. And one time during one of the tries, there was a huge shipwreck. Ganjin almost loses his life. Half of the crew dies. He survives, but he actually goes blind due to his injuries. And actually, he does finally make it to Nara on the 7th try in 754. And he comes, but he's already blind. But he finally makes it after all this time and to teach Buddhism in Japan. So Ganjin was already well known when he arrives. So he comes to Nara, he moves in, and he's very, very well respected by everybody in Japan, whether it's the imperial family, whether it's the Uji clans, the Fujiwara family, for example. Everybody really respects Ganjin because he was considered the know-it-all about everything related to Buddhism. So he's automatically appointed the head priest of Todaiji Temple. This is a huge deal because the person who previously had this role was Emperor Shomu before he died. So now he is the head priest of the National Center of Buddhism in Japan. That's a big deal. And he's so well respected that in 759, only a few years after he arrives, he's actually able to found his own temple near Nara, which is known as Tosho Daiji Temple. So it's a lesser temple, not as prestigious as Todaiji, but Ganjin basically founded the temple himself. So this temple, if you want to know anything about Ganjin, you go to Nara, please go to Tosho Daiji Temple. It has everything you would need to know about Ganjin's life. And not only did Ganjin spread knowledge about Buddhism to the Japanese, but he also spreads knowledge about Chinese culture. So it's very, he really tries to modernize Japan even more, to become even more cosmopolitan. Unfortunately, he doesn't stay in Japan so long because in 763 he passes away blind. And the Japanese people were, they still remember Ganjin. He's actually a very famous historical figure even today. And a clay sculpture of him, it was designed and displayed in Toshodaiji Temple, which makes sense because that's the temple where Ganjin is enshrined. So it's sort of like a personal shrine to Ganjin. You can see this statue of him if you visit the temple. In addition to history books that were written, the two we discussed, the Kojiki and the Nihon Shoki, Japan has been famous for poetry for a long time. I'm sure all of you have heard of haiku, right? And so Japanese poetry really begins to develop during this Nara period. And there were two poetry collections, known as anthologies, that were written during the Nara period. The first one, the oldest poetry collection in Japan, very, very famous, is known as the Manyoshu. Okay, the Manyoshu contains 4,500 poems. And the cool thing about the Manyoshu is they were supposed to be written by people from all social classes. They had a contest, and they said you can submit poems. So emperors submitted poems, nobles, members of the noble class, the aristocratic classes, soldiers, peasants, farmers. And then you could also have an anonymous submission if you didn't want your name to be there. Now, keep this in mind that when I say peasants and farmers in the Nara period were almost always illiterate. And so we wonder, would a peasant be able to write poetry if they couldn't write? So there's a theory that, there's actually a couple of theories. Some people think that they would send people to the provinces and listen to songs or poems by the peasants, by the farmers, who would then, and then the people who were literate, the scribes, would transcribe it and write it in for them. And then another theory is that no farmer ever contributed to the Manyoshu, and that these were just written by basically nobles who wanted to write from the perspective of a farmer, and they made it seem like a farmer wrote it. So we don't really know, but it's, everyone will say that farmers wrote in the Manyoshu. The poems have many themes: happiness, love, death, sadness, contemporary themes. And the interesting thing about this is that it's very different from traditional Chinese-style poetry. So even though there's so much Chinese influence coming in during the Nara period, the Manyoshu has a very quote-unquote Japanese theme or Japanese tone to it. It's very native. It doesn't really have a lot of Chinese-style influence. And this is an example of a poem from the Manyoshu. As I turn my gaze upward and see the crescent moon, I am reminded of the trailing eyebrows of the woman I saw but once. And so, this is a very contemporary, you could see this type of poem today even. It was very, very before its time. And so that was the Manyoshu. There is another poetry anthology written known as the Kaifuso. And the Kaifuso is very, very Chinese in its writing. So unlike the Manyoshu, which was more Japanese themed, the Kaifuso is very, very Chinese style. And it's almost identical to the poetry that was written in China during this period. So it's sort of based off of that type of poetry. And unlike the Manyoshu, which claims to have been written by people from all social classes, all walks of life, the Manyoshu was written purely by scholars and nobles. So generally, it's not as accessible to modern readers as the Manyoshu. If you're interested in poetry, I would recommend the Manyoshu over the Kaifuso. So we end in about the late 8th century, the late 700s. We see at the end of the Nara period, Japan is almost not comparable to before, when we started with the Asuka period in this lesson. You have a strong centralized bureaucratic government with the emperor at the top and helped by various noble aristocratic families like the Fujiwara who are helping him rule. Very similar to the Chinese system with a strong imperial family at the top. In other words, the advisors can help out, the Fujiwara can say what they want, but the emperor has final say of everything. If the emperor doesn't agree with it, nothing's going to happen. So this is very similar to China, with the emperor at the top. Lots of strong Buddhist influence, right? We have Todaiji Temple now, and Shinto is still remaining strong, though. They're working together. Remember, they're complementing each other. You have new art, literature, architecture, all influenced by China, okay? And political and cultural influence as well. But keep in mind that Chinese influence doesn't completely get rid of Japan, right? You have influence. It's there. It has a very, very strong Chinese influence to it, but the Japanese still maintain their little characteristics. For example, the Manyoshu. It's based off of, it's written in Chinese characters, which came from China, but the themes in terms of nature and aesthetics and beauty are all influenced by Japanese culture. And so, the Chinese influence is strong, but there's always a little Japanese twist to it, which reminds you that, okay, this is from China, but we're going to add our own flavor to this. And finally, what about the peasants and lower classes? We haven't really talked much about them. That's because outside of the capital, outside of the city of Nara, Japan was still an agricultural farming society. Most peasants would basically spend their childhood all the way until their death farming, cultivating rice, not having enough food to eat, being illiterate, having to send their children off to military service or to get married into farming families. And so this culture that we discuss, Nara period culture, is not really for all the Japanese people. The peasants were not allowed or not able to participate in this high culture of Nara. They weren't allowed to have the nice residences I showed you, or they were not allowed to go to Todaiji Temple and attend a class on calligraphy or on Buddhist philosophy, or read the Manyoshu, or read the Kojiki. That was reserved for the imperial family and the aristocratic classes in the city of Nara. If you go to the provinces, nothing really has changed much from the previous periods. And unfortunately, this will remain, this sad plight for peasants will remain until the 1870s. Generally, more or less, their plight as poor farmers doesn't really change over the centuries until we enter the industrial age and westernization in Japan in the 1870s. So this continues for about 1,000 years. Peasants are not able to contribute or be a part of culture as we know it, high culture.